Thank you very much, Hildegund, for that kind introduction, and Kimberly for inviting me, Simone for taking such good care of me till the last minute. I had originally called this talk The Pursuit of the Planetary. That's kind of got pluralized, so it's become Planetary Pursuits, which could mean different kinds of pursuits within a planet, or different kind of planetary pursuits if we see planets as plurals. I like to begin with this image because it looks to me like there are two cosmonauts or astronauts on a foreign planet. If you take away the vegetation and the building sites, this could look a lot like Mars because it's got that reddish soil, a lot of iron in the soil, old rocks. It's very close to my home. I used to play here as a child in these rocks, and they are, as I will elaborate later, the oldest mountains in the world, and they are in Delhi. I propose the planet to overwrite the globe. That's something that I'm borrowing from Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, with whom it's possible to have a lifetime of arguments and resonances and amazing synergies. And this is from an essay called Planetarity, which will recur in this presentation. But I want to keep it as a kind of epitaph for the very beginning of what we're going to consider. This is a still from a film that has stayed with me all my life. It's Oporajito, the second part of the Opu trilogy by Satyajit Ray, in which the young Opu, now a teenager, goes to Calcutta to learn about the world. And if you notice, he's carrying with him the planet in his hands, along with his luggage. And this plays a role in the film, which we'll get to later. But I like to think of this image and it's his sort of slightly distracted, questioning look as the becoming philosophical of the world, which is at the same time becoming worldly, the worldliness of philosophy. Its realization is at the same time its loss. That's the youngish Karl Marx, not as young as Opu here, but thinking about the relationship between worlds, worldliness, thinking, travel, movement, gaining things and losing things. You find the world in all sorts of places. Here I found half the world in a park in Shanghai, lying quietly by itself with a shovel propped up against it, proposing in a sense that, things need to be dug out. So I've always thought that the shovel is to dig out the rest of the world from this image. You find it in moments of quiet reflection. Here is Opu again from Oporajito, considering the planet in a crowded train while he is moving on a moving body, moving through space, moving with the earth in his hands, sitting on the earth while the earth moves through space. That is what it means to be in a planetary condition. The word planet comes from the Greek astar planetes, which means a wandering star. So we are vagabonds on a vagabond in that sense. And the planet has had various incarnations. This is a early 19th century globe from India, and it's written in Devanagari script. And I want to remark on these images. They're from a remarkable book by Sumati Ramaswamy, who is a historian and an art historian who's been looking at images of the globe in non-Western contexts. And this is a word play between my two primary languages, English and Bangla. It's part of the title card of an exhibition called Planetary Planning, curated by Devika Singh in the last Dhaka Art Summit. And Diana Campbell-Betancourt is here, and it was a remarkable exhibition. And being in this exhibition actually made me begin thinking a lot of things, some of which are finding a midway sort of home within this presentation. So planetary, or as we say in Bangla, groho jagotik, which is a nice mouthful of a word, groho jagotik. The words on top by Frank Borman are from the Apollo 8 1968 mission in December 1968. They were performing a circumnavigation of the moon, and roughly, I think, 9 months after I was born. So I like to think of 1968 as that year in which this picture emerged. It's called Earthrise. And if you look for it on the internet, you can actually find a film of it and of them talking. It's too long for me to play here, but I would recommend it. And he says, oh my God, look at that picture over there. Here's the Earth coming up. And then somebody says to Frank Borman, that's not a scheduled photograph. You know, you're not supposed to point the picture because they have very specific tasks of what pictures they have to take. And he takes the picture anyway, and then they all get involved in taking the picture. And then they take several pictures, and there are several iconic Earthrise pictures from that, I don't know what to call it, day or night in December of the terrestrial year in 1968. And think of that along with this quote by Martin Heidegger, the age of the world picture. The fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as a picture. And we have to think of various map-making exercises which begin to be the beginnings or the prefaces to conquests of all kinds. And I say this because I'm also going to argue that there are other kinds of pictures of the world and of the planet, and we'll get to that a little later. So here is the film, actually. We have it, so we can listen to a little bit of it.
Set. The impact crater with
so they have to take these pictures of the lunar surface.
Just prior to the subsolar point.
There's general chatter. And there's the Earthrise. This is a simulation of that event, of what, looking at it
yeah, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty.
But the sound is the...
Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color, quick.
Oh, man, that's great. Where is it?
Quick.
Down here?
Just grab me a color. A color exterior. Hurry up. Got one?
Yeah, I'm looking for one. C368.
Anything, quick.
Here.
Got it.
We missed it.
And so it disappears. And then it'll reappear on the other window a little later.
Hey, I've got it right here.
Let me get up this a lot clearer.
So the significance of this image is not that it's the first image of the Earth. There have been other images of the Earth before. There was one before this from other spacecraft. But it's the first image that shows the Earth in relation to another cosmic body. So in a sense, we are already one step away from the Earth's habitation in space. We're already with 1 foot almost somewhere else on some other planetary, because even the moon is a sort of quasi-planetary entity. And that has consequences, which we will talk about later. But what I really like is how the Earth actually plays hide and seek with these people. The Earth is playing a game with those who are trying to capture it as an image, as a world picture. And that sense of the world deploying itself as a game is a very old idea, and this is a thinker that I think needs to be thought about much more than he is. Kostas Axelos, a Greek Marxist who lived in exile in France and Paris most of his time, and developed this idea of the world game, which he inherited from his reading of Heraclitus, from Anaximander, and he was constantly saying we need to play the world as a kind of game. It's one way of thinking about the category that I'm trying to introduce to you as worldliness, the world game. And he opposes the idea of globalization, which is a flattening, in a sense, of processes. And remember, globalization talks about the world as if it had no past and no future, as if this globalizing now was in itself the most important thing. Whereas planetary, I would argue, includes the birth, childhood, adolescence, and the future senescence of the planet. The planet is something that moves not just in space, but actually in time. And if it moves in time, then the planet changes, and things on the planet change. We change, life changes. The other person that I want to keep as a reference is Edouard Gleason, who also played with the term mondialisation and thought of the world not in terms of fixed entities of space, but as relations between archipelagic sort of entities. We've been recently doing some work rereading Gleason and trying to intervene and make up new words to sort of extend the vocabulary that Gleason gifted us with. And there are several here. For instance, he's talking about relation, which in his sort of lovely rambling way, he talks about relation is no longer relation. Now, what do we do when we believe this? We call into question in a formal manner the idea of the universal. The universal is a sublimation and an abstraction that enables us to forget small differences. We drift upon the universal and forget these small differences. And relation is wonderful because it doesn't allow us to do that. There is no such thing as a relation made up of big differences. Relation is total. It's about the tiniest differences in the world. It's about nuance. It's about finding little bits of difference. And it's to do that, perhaps, that we began looking at activities of surveying. And here is a work by us, which is just a picture brought to life. It begins in darkness with a faint, perhaps, constellation of stars, which, if I speed up this film, will begin to appear as dots on a surveyor's board in a windowed room where there are people drawing maps while human beings disappear across slopes and lots of things happen. A man writes in a ledger, a fan gently moves, the color of bottles on the shelf changes, the paper rustles, and a point is made on paper with ink. This is a very speeded up version, because I don't want to keep you waiting, of a work called Afternoon Undisturbed on the Richter scale. And these gentlemen are actually part of a photograph taken by a man called Stonehouse, I think his name is, who's a photographer, took this photograph in 1911, and we made this work exactly 100 years later. His name is James Waterhouse. And he takes this picture of the surveyors in the survey of India, the people who are making all those little ridges in the landscape. Every little rock is inscribed into the great trigonometric and then the great survey of India. So they become, in a sense, minor correctors to every first draft of history, which is what we see our work as doing. If global histories tend to produce large, overarching sweeps, then our task is to mend, is to do the little repair of the things that get cracked and torn and erased in the production of these large world-conquering pictures. But these are also pictures of the world. So we do, in a sense, what we could call a kind of hysterectomy. This is a word proposed by the Raqs Media Collective in the spirit of Edouard Gleason to suggest that there are certain operations that need to be undertaken to deal with fibroid excesses in historical narratives, which say, oh, this world or that world, instead of saying this corner of this world, or how the world and the stars and the moon looks at from my backyard. So it's basically a story or a set of stories. A story told by a person who is a citizen like me, a person born in a city, to the world and for the world. If you look at the frame story of the Arabian Nights, there's a story told by a woman called Shahrazad. The Arabian Nights are not Arabian, and they don't take place at night, most of them. This frame story happens in a night. But they're Alif Layla wa Layla, which are in all our languages, from Iran to India to the different Arabias to Turkey. And then sort of interpolations in French and English and so on. So the story is told by a woman called Shahrazad, which can translate as city-born or free city, to a king who is trying to execute all of his wives one by one. And the story is a holding operation because her sister appears from under the bed, and her name, incidentally, is Dunyazad, or world-born, or free world. So the world-born asks for a kind of caesura in the relentless march of executions by asking the city-born to tell a story. So if we want the king not to cut off our heads, we have to tell stories to the world. That's how I see this planetary imperative. Incidentally, Shahrazad and Dunyazad are two craters on the moon of Saturn, one of the moons of Saturn. So the bigger one is Shahrazad, and the smaller circle is Dunyazad. This is the theme of the strange names of astral objects that will recur in this presentation, and I hope not to bore you too much with my amateur astronomy. The world figures a lot in myths and legends. Here is the Varaha Avatar, one of the avatars of the preserver deity Vishnu in some kinds of Hindu mythology, holding the world up on his tusks, together with Atlas, who also holds up the world on his shoulders. And this is the logo of the Atlas Bicycle Company, the largest producers of bicycles in India. So everybody who rides an Atlas bicycle, and there are millions of them, are in fact the world riding on the shoulders of Atlas. And I've always liked that thought. We are all worlds on our planetary pursuits. An old globe, a Puranic globe, not congruent with our geographies, but suggesting other kinds of geographies, but still postulated in a spherical form. Globes of the world that were from the late 18th century in Bangla and Urdu and Persian, produced in presses in India as part of geography lessons and geography education, which underwent a major expansion. Charts of the solar system, just to give you an idea that the idea of the cosmos and the globe and the sphere and the planet has different kinds of provenance. It's not just something that happens between Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. It has other origins in other parts of the world. And there is a commerce with Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. And there's a commerce of ideas and interactions, of pictures of the world, if you think. This is a world map in the Jame Masjid, the Friday prayer mosque in Delhi, built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. This is obviously a later edition because there was no Australia in the world map of Shah Jahan. But it's interesting that it's there because the mosque's formal name is the Masjid Jahanuma, which means the mosque that looks out onto the world, that has a world vista in front of it, planetary vision. Astrolabes. I don't know if this is known well because astrolabes are the GPS systems of the late medieval world. And people, all sorts of travelers and sailors and explorers and merchants and pilgrims used astrolabes. And the world monopoly on astrolabe production, fine astrolabe production, was actually in the Punjabi city of Lahore. That's where the best astrolabes were made between the 14th and the 17th centuries. And all over the world, people were vying to get Lahori astrolabes. And there is apparently, till date, a Lahori family that goes by the name Asturlabi, who obviously inherited the art of astrolabe making. It is possible that Columbus, not Magellan, but Columbus used on his ships astrolabes made in Lahore while he was looking for a way to India. All sorts of other machines, observatories, produced from the 16th, 17th century onwards in different parts of India, Iran, and Turkey to correctly calculate the rising and setting of stars and suns, the exact timing of eclipses, the precise calibration and prediction of the great festivals of the Near East, were very important things, and they had enormous political implications. And these could not have been done without the creation of many different kinds of world pictures. So here we see astronomer, astrologer at work in his workshop with sextants, astrolabes, and globes of different kinds. So pictures of globes start appearing in all sorts of cultural material. This is, of course, the famous Hans Holbein's ambassador's image with the twisted skull in the foreground, but you'll notice that there are two globes on the shelf. Queen Elizabeth commissions portraits, a series of portraits. This is the Civ portrait. And at first, the first one has a shadowy globe. Within 4 years, the globe has acquired greater prominence. And there is a motto somewhere in the painting which says, "All the things that I want but do not have," which obviously says something. But at the same time as Elizabeth is producing her world pictures, Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, is also commissioning portraits with globes. And he sits first on an Arcadian globe where the lion and the lamb share their peace, and then on an actual globe of the world. While in the first one, he's practicing archery and destroying the metaphorical figure of poverty, that dark figure over there. In the second, he's shooting the decapitated head of the African rebel general Malik Ambar, who led a uprising in the Shia states of the south, which he put down with great severity. So the world was very much his battlefield. More pictures of the world. The lion and the lamb appear. The lion is the Mughal emperor, and the lamb is the Safavid emperor, Tahmasp I. And they are embracing on the picture of the world between their divided the realms. Clearly, Jahangir has an idea of who is the lion and who is the lamb. And finally, a portrait with him looking at the world as if it were an apple that he was just about to eat. So pictures of people in power encountering, kind of containing, consuming the world are legion, because they are all indicators of the world-conquering ambitions of these people, and they are distributed equally, I think, through the cultures of the world. The British Empire produced its own map with its trilogy of one-word slogans, not liberty, equality, and fraternity, but freedom, fraternity, and federation, and alliterative FFF, with Britannia sitting on the world. You find variants of this image. For instance, this is next to Prince Albert's mausoleum, just very close to the Serpentine. If you walk to the Serpentine Gallery, you have to pass this on your left, and this is India and Asia. There's Africa, and there's Oceania. There's other groups as well. So in this mode of producing sort of commemorative statuary to things that mean a lot but say very little, we produced a set of sculptures that are evacuated, and this is one of them. It's sitting right now in front of the K21 at Dusseldorf, and it's called the empty robe, and it sort of takes as its point of reference the robe of Lord Curzon. You see the robe with a Viceroy Lord Curzon in it, in an abandoned relic park of statues in Delhi, but we just sort of took Lord Curzon out and left his robe behind, sort of like the emperor's new clothes in reverse, old clothes in reverse. One can tell a history of the world with many kinds of objects, with globes that belong to kings, but also with silent and incomplete or destroyed Buddhas. This is an image, and now there's a series of images that I'm showing you, which are indexes of all our research and travel in the production of many works. So these images find their way into different works in the Raqs Media Collective. This is from a stupa in Bihar, which is a monument to doubt, to the Buddha's Charter of Free Inquiry, in which he says, doubt everything until it makes sense to you without deference to authority and provided it makes provisions for everybody. We were investigating this site in relation to a film that we made on George Orwell, in which he also makes this remarkable statement: socialism means that the world is a raft floating through space, a planetary image, with provisions for everybody. So this resonance between these two documents or statements separated very far apart in time seem to make sense in terms of trying to map a planet moving in time and space. You could also see a tree standing after the tsunami at Fukushima. This is the exact site of the nuclear meltdown. This is a tree that stood. Everything else here is flattened. One tree sort of bent when the wave came and then stood up again, and this is that tree. This is a radiation Geiger counter near that tree, which is still measuring the radiation. This is a memorial to a coal mining accident on the coast of County Durham in northeastern England. This is a dead poet's typewriter in Guatemala. This is a man in Guatemala looking at pictures of women who disappeared in the police archives. This is a bridge being built across a river in North India. This is a volcano that might erupt any day. These are leaves of the ginkgo tree, the only living being that still comes from the Precambrian extinction. It's a tree that has no living relatives. It's unique on its own. You see it everywhere. It's a decorative tree, but ginkgo balboa is on its own on the planet, no relatives. And these are the Cedars of Lebanon. Tony Chakar took me to see these cedars with other friends. And they are remarkable because some of them have been around since the time of the Gilgamesh was written, where Enkidu and Humbaba fought in the cedar groves of Lebanon in precisely this spot on the Masr al-Shuf. There are trees here that are at least 3,500 years old. So they have seen the rise and fall of the Babylonian Empire, the different states of the Levant, the rise and fall of the great Iranian kingdoms and empires, the Roman empires, the Crusades, and they've been a witness to all of that and a kind of testament to the history of the planet. So what I'm proposing is that just as you can create a planetary narrative by looking at the pictures of Elizabeth and Jahangir and the globes, you can also create a picture that looks at ginkgo leaves, a typewriter, a Geiger counter, a standing tree, and a cedar grove. This is also another way of creating images of planetary consciousness. You could, for instance, also look at a piece of rock that is actually older than the planet. This is the Kitiokari meteorite, which fell in the Arctic Circle a few million years ago, but carbon dating has proved that it is actually 500 million years older than the Earth. So it started its voyage when the Earth was not yet formed. And it's sitting right here in a tiny village somewhere in northern Sweden until it found its way on loan into an installation of ours. So all these are ways in which one can create relationships between anybody, me, you, any one of the 7 billion inhabitants of the world who are human, not the others, whose total weight and mass amounts just about the same as the total weight and mass of all the ants on the planet. So if you count all the human beings and put them on a weighing scale, they weigh just as much as all the ants put together. So anybody, everybody, somebody, antibody, the billions of beings coursing within us, one can create relationships between them because each one of us is also like a wandering planet inhabited by other beings. A vagabond standing on a vagabond that is floating through space, like Opu with his globe in a chain. You can sense a geography of time and feelings that's different. This is an atlas of emotions. The same feelings structured around different parts of the world, so that it's remorse past guilt in Vienna, while it's epiphany past fatigue, maybe in New York, or anxiety past ecstasy, maybe in New Delhi. A different sense of thinking about the body and how it relates to the world by, for instance, asking, how salty are your tears this morning? As long as the Baltic Sea has less salt than human tears, we're okay. Because the moment the Baltic Sea has more salt than human tears, it's an index of the fact that global warming has risen to an irretrievable point, because seawater has rushed in from the Atlantic into the Baltic Sea because of the rise of sea levels. So you have to make sure that the levels of salt remain the same, which is important because you're in Salzburg, and this is a city founded on salt. And these are salt mines a little distance under your feet. That's why this is Salzburg, in the Salzkammergut. And there's a reason why it is Salzburg. There's a reason why there's salt everywhere in the world. This is nearer home to where I am, in the Rann of Kutch. That's Monica with a tripod, my colleague, walking into the far horizon as we try and take a measure of infinity on a salt flat. But why salt? This is a salt crystal from Hallstatt, which is a village close to here, mining village. Because the salt in Salzburg and traces of vegetation in different parts of the world are also testaments to histories. There's salt here in the ground. There's other things in the rocks near my house. For instance, traces of this tree-sized fern-like plant, which doesn't exist anymore, called the Glossopteris. And a man called Henry Medlicott proposed that wherever there was Glossopteris in the ground was one kind of place. And he said, he gave it the name Gondwana in India because he found it most concentrated amongst the habitations of the Gond indigenous aboriginal people of central and eastern India, who speak a very ancient language called Gondi, substrata of Mundari. And Edward Suess, who I think you learn about in science textbooks in Austria, I don't know if you do anymore, but he's a very important man in planetary geology. And he took the term Gond from Gondwana, from Henry Medlicott, looked at the distribution of the Glossoreptis plant all over the world, and found that wherever the Glossoreptis plant was found must have been part of one substrate. So he called it Gondwana land. And then he looked at other pieces of the ground, like the salt in Salzburg. Where does the salt in Salzburg come from? Where does the Glossoreptis come from in other parts of the world? And this is the puzzle that Edward Suess was working on between Vienna and Salzburg and Graz not so long ago. What he found here were ammonite fossils. So two different kinds of fossils. Fossils of fern-like trees in one place, fossils of marine animals in another, in the high mountains of Austria, which led him to propose that these two parts of the world were actually strangely sort of mirrors of each other. This Austria, that's Gondwana at the bottom, which actually is, as you can see, almost all of South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, which was India's closest neighbor, and Australia, until they all drifted apart. And that dark green band is the distribution of the Glossoreptis plant as a fossil trace. And here in the middle is the Gondi word for earth, Nelle. So that gives you two kinds of landscape. The panorama of the Salzkammergut region up there and the rocks next to my house in Delhi. Here, India is on her way to her tryst with Asia. And here, the Tethys Sea, which was a long band of marine water body, is closing as the continents move towards each other. In 2 minutes, we move roughly 70 or 170 million years in this, so this is pretty fast, the simulation. But it gives you a sense of how the sea closes in and how mountains rise. And that's what happened here. This place that we are standing on right now, where you live, looked like this once upon a time. There is Austria in the middle of the sea that is not the Mediterranean, but the Tethys. And if you think of this kind of fluidity of the world, you begin to get a very different picture of what the planet is. Let us mark this moment by marking the way this location allows us to address the question of what we call the planetary, which is fluid, because it takes the career of the sphere we live on in time, not as a frozen ball suspended in place, but as a fluid, wandering star, moving through and in time. Think about where Austria is now and where it was some time ago, where it will be in a few million years. This is not just a configuration of the international as being an accumulation of different local experiences, but the idea that everyone has the right to take their own central but fluid position anywhere on the planet. The 21st century displaces assumptions that certain histories or cultural experiences have a greater global presence or claim to stability than others. Rather, different geologies, peoples, societies, ecosystems have as much to teach the whole world as any other. If you want to think about how to conserve the planet, then the experiences of people in Papua New Guinea are as important as those in the far Arctic regions or in the Rust Belt of the US or in the salt mines of Austria. Along with this greater planetary consciousness, there is, of course, also greater anxiety. Those who captain the ship of contemporary art have expressed anxiety that perhaps the assumption of the global planetary is premature. I've heard this even from progressive colleagues who say we neglected what was under our eyes and therefore also neglected the rise of xenophobic nationalism and so on. I don't think the answer is a return to parochial sensibilities, even in order to correct them. I don't think that's even a way of addressing local realities. This is the delusion intellectuals have when they do not connect with people on the street. If they connected with people on the street, they would understand that ordinary citizens of the world have a fairly good idea about a new, not transcendental, but transcendental cosmopolitanism, a democratic or perhaps even a proletarian cosmopolitanism. A German called Hermann Gorter, exactly 100 years ago to this day, said, "The time is ripe for world revolution." And he didn't mean it in some abstract sense. He said, there are things happening all over the world right now, and if only we connected them, we would be able to challenge capitalism as a globe, as a world, as a planetary system. Perhaps we've forgotten that. The First World War and the Second World War and the rhetoric of anti-imperialism that overtook the Third World made it very easy for people to forget the fact that actually, like geological realities, all other realities that we have created are deeply connected across fault lines. Take a look at this animation of the world. It's only up to 2013. It's from 1979, the year of the Iranian Revolution. 2013, Wall Street protests. There are 250 million incidents across the world. And they're actually rising in intensity and frequency everywhere. So there's a lot of nostalgia for 1968 nowadays, because like me, those who were born in that magic year are 50 and we think that means something. But if you look at the global incidence of dissidence, dissent, protest in the world right now, It's much higher than 2018. They're also much more interconnected. And they're also a slightly different population that is actually producing these events on the ground. They appear and they disappear. They do not yield iconic leaders like Che Guevara or Tariq Ali or Daniel Cohn-Bendit. They produce different kinds of figures. And that, I think, is actually much more interesting. Because Che Guevara and Tariq Ali and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, for all their heroism, were still very focused on the seizure of particular power. Whereas the street protests of this time, which I think have a geological nature, a more erosionary character, are more interested in addressing very particular but also very global realities, like assaults on healthcare, like maternity benefits, like insurance, like the cuts in education in schools, like the rise in the pensionable age, that people have to work longer. Here are protests, for instance, in Bangladesh, which are happening right now, and are put down with extraordinary ferocity, just as like they're put down with extraordinary ferocity in India, or in Pakistan, or in Iran, or in Turkey, or in Italy, or in Greece, or in Portugal, or in Britain, or anywhere else in the world. But often at the forefront of this new moment, you see very, very young women. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. We did not see them in the great street riots so much of Paris in 1968, or even Calcutta in 1968 and 69. I've looked at film footage from Calcutta in 1968-69. All the revolutionaries are 23-year-old men. But 15-year-old high school students, girls who appear and disappear, who do not yield leaderships, who do not assume responsible positions that can be produced, so that the states have actually got to pick on, like in Bangladesh, they've picked on a 50-something dedicated photojournalist man who has not led the protests, and they've made him into the face of it because they actually cannot deal with what's going on the street. They're punishing the young people on the street, and they're treating them with extraordinary severity, but they do not know who is the leader. And that's a change. That's a change, perhaps, in global consciousness. What happens when worlds collide? What is the future of our auguries? What dances when forces gather and disperse? I'm very interested in the intersections of the histories of anarchism, geography, and geology. And this little tacky image is from the front cover of a book by a remarkable man, Élisée Reclus, who was a militant in the Paris Commune, but also the founder of the discipline of universal geography. And he wrote a book by that name. So if you look at Reclus, Suez, Wegener, who comes later, who proposed the theory of the continental drift, these are all people who are trying to read the ground, traces of the earth itself, for a very different imagination of what the world is and can be. So one of his books is, of course, called Homme et la Terre, and I find it uncanny that it should have a pre-resonance, if you like, or is there a reverse of déjà vu of the Earthrise picture, right? That's his proposed model for the Great Globe, which he wanted to produce in the Paris Universal Exposition of 1900. Never got built, but he wanted people to actually take a walk around the world and go into its inside and look at the evolution of life, because he thought that was the most urgent political project of the time. It's a matter of some interest to me that the failure to achieve a vision of the world in 1900 also produces the circumstances that lead to the mass slaughter of 1914 to 18. If you read histories of the First World War, and it's interesting to do that now because we're 100 years later, we're working in Raqs on a project that looks at the medical histories of First World War soldiers from India. But no one can predict the First World War. Everybody is like, they're all in harmony and everybody is at peace. the German Kaiser is an admiral in the British Navy, and the British king is the cousin of the German Kaiser, and they're all having tea, and then it all goes, crazy. Why does this happen? Why can they not try and understand where the race to produce and consume the world is taking them? Perhaps it's taking them in the direction of thinking of a railroad as a kind of excavatory project, a railroad that begins in Berlin and ends in Baghdad. And it is exactly the same route today that refugees take in the reverse direction. They travel along the stops of the never-finished Berlin-Baghdad railway that was one of the precipitating causes of the First World War. So it's Iraq, Kurdistan, Syria, the Balkans, into Central Europe, through Austria, into Berlin. That's the route that the refugees take. It's as if the ghosts of the First World War, the planetary ghosts of the First World War, are beginning to rise yet again. So this leads to a strange kind of idea of how do we care? This is another image from Élisée Reclus's book of a human female holding the earth in her hands. And this kind of image has an interesting analogous history, and I'm now coming to the end of my talk. In 1957, Hannah Arendt writes a remarkable essay as the prologue to The Human Condition, in which she reflects on the Sputnik. And the Sputnik is an object in space floating above the Earth. And she says, for the first time, it gives us the feeling of being detached from terrestrial limits. And she wonders, where is this going to take us? Is it going to take us in a direction where we forget the Earth and what worldliness means? Or is it going to take us in a direction where care is reintroduced into our vocabulary because we can see how fragile the thing is, the blue marble in space is. And this then gets taken again by Adrienne Rich, the poet and essayist. And in her, in a remarkable poem in a book, that's the Sputnik. And by the way, Hannah Arendt, like Scheherazade and Dunyazad, is also an asteroid. So she is asteroid number 100027. You can find her in the Atlas of Minor Planets. She is somewhere in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, circling. So you have to be careful about what you wish for. When Hannah Arendt began thinking about the consequences of this disembodied view, I don't think she understood that she would end up being an asteroid in space. So, the Atlas of a Difficult World, Adrienne Rich. Here is a map of our country. Here is the Sea of Indifference, glazed with salt. This is the haunted river flowing from brow to groin. We do not taste its water. There is the desert where missiles are planted like corns. This is the breadbasket of foreclosed farms. This is the birthplace of the rockabilly boy. This is the cemetery of the poor who died for democracy, and so on. Later, in a series of essays where she talks about world repairing, the old idea in the Talmud of tikkun, of repairing the fractured little bits of the world that are left over from creation. She says, yet, and she is talking about Hannah Arendt's human, what is that book? The Human Condition, where she's sort of center-pointing the centrality of labor, world-making activity. And there is only one note, as Adrienne Rich says, about the labor of women in The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt. It's a footnote in one minor place where Arendt actually quotes Marx by saying Marx talked about the reproduction of social labor, and that's what makes us understand what the labor of women is. But, so Arendt says, yet, it is this activity of world protection, world preservation, world repair, the million tiny stitches. Remember Gleason's idea of the tiny million differences. The fiction of the scrubbing brush, the scoring cloth, the iron across the shirt, the rubbing of cloth against itself to exercise the strain, the renewal of the scorched pot, the rusted knife blade, the invisible weaving of a frayed and threadbare family life, the cleaning up of the soil and waste left behind by men and children. If we see the wave of global protests, whether it is to protect the Provident Fund provision by garment factory workers in South India, who are all women, or to prevent road accidents from killing school children by young school children, many of them women in Bangladesh, or to protest against sexual violence on the streets of Delhi, again led by women, or to talk about the rising cost of farming, again led by women in India, or to produce the various different kinds of million women marches in different parts of the world. You see that in all these activities, there is a concern for the body, for health, for sexual freedom and autonomy. I'm reminded, for instance, of the dancing protests by young women on the streets of Tehran to express the freedom to dance in public, or to eat, or to have proper nutrition or air. These are very different political projects from the grand power takeover projects of the 20th century in the name of democracy, liberty, and freedom. These are projects of repair that are also projects of revolution. And perhaps their planetary sense of time is both slower, but at the same time more radical than anything else that has preceded before. So I will end with this image of touching a meteorite that is older by 500 million years than the Earth itself, to remind us of what it means to be intimate in a bodily sense with our planetary beings. Thank you very much.
Since nobody else is asking a question, what I was trying to understand, and maybe with your help you can help me. So the question isn't that we're moving completely away from an older way of interacting with power structures, which you characterize sort of in May 68, sort of a more direct political upheavals that have a particular type of relationship with power.
Could you please perhaps stand up? Then it
demands
is
a certain kind of things, in opposed to these new upheavals that you illustrated. But because to me those first demands not only have not been addressed, but they haven't also gone away. They haven't been addressed, and those problems have not gone away. So the question is how these two sort of come together, or how one impact the other. Because say, for instance, right now, on one layer you have, say, the women protesting in Tehran, right? But then you also have the sanctions, which has to do with the old Westphalian order of a nation state doing things, or the trade war that's going on right now between, say, China and the US. So these larger sort of old political problems, which constitute colonialism, have not gone away, yet they've been complicated with this new set of things that you illustrated. So I was wondering, what do you think about how these two will, how we have to work these two together? Because it's not a matter of, I'm sure you agree with me, it's not a matter of abandoning one and just going with the second.
Yeah, that gives me a nice opportunity to show you something I missed doing for reasons of time. Two things. This is a song from Bengal by a man called Lalon Fakir. And it says, you can read what it says, but what I like is the evocation of the word dunyadari, which you understand in Farsi. And it says, observe unbedazzled the luster of the world. Now, dunyadari is something that I have always tried to translate as worldliness, which means a straightforward, pragmatic understanding of the different forces at play and at work. For instance, if there is a protest against a copper smelter in Southeast India, like the ones in Bangladesh, it was treated with exceptional severity a few months ago. The police opened fire, 15 people died. Now, to address the question of the copper smelter, I think it's very important for the people who are in those protests to understand that they're standing against a local municipal authority that is backing a industrial conglomerate that is multinational, which is an Indian company which has now its headquarters in London and operates in the whole world, from Australia to everywhere. They also need to understand that in the period in which the pollution from the copper smelter increased by 50% is also the period by which the pollution from copper smelters in China decreased by 75%. Not with an overall decrease in the production of copper, right? You can see this fluctuation in sulfur dioxide poisoning of the air if you look at NASA satellite photographs. They point red blobs in southern eastern India. They make red blobs in eastern and central China, and then the red blobs decrease and increase in their intensity. Production of copper stays the same. In fact, rises in China. So something must have been done in China, which was not done in southeastern India, which made sure that the pollution from copper smelting, very specific thing, I'm not talking about all pollution, reduced. In terms of effective political action, to make arguments in cases and so on, this requires people who are on the street to have an intimate knowledge of satellite data. Now, this is what I call worldliness. It requires an understanding of planetary dynamics of the productions of capitalism. It requires an understanding of global climate change treaties, and it requires effective organizing on the ground. Neither of these different concentric circles of action is more important than the other. And it's the combination of being able to have an ambidextrous or a bifocal view that is both planetary and not global. I mean planetary, because it needs to look at the history of the planet, and also local and in present here and now, that I think makes for effective political action. So the combination of dancing on the streets has to understand the strengthening of the Iranian regime by a climate of sanctions. Sanctions do not weaken the Iranian regime, they strengthen it. So only an understanding of the global processes that strengthen the theocracy in Iran. So in that sense, Donald Trump is the best friend of Ayatollah Khamenei, because he strengthens Khamenei. And this is something we know. He has actually made the position of the North Korean dictator more stable. So all processes of local resistance, in a sense, need to be able to understand this. The overall political rhetoric of the left across the world has been to substitute understanding for sentimental solidarity. Right? So we all produce solidarities with very little effort at understanding. So if I am actually quite fed up with third world solidarity, and I wish it would cease, but I am more interested in the magnification of the global processes of understanding. So instead of having fake support for non-aligned movements, which was the club of dictators of the former East or the third world, if Central European radicals could actually understand how deeply implicated their lives are with people elsewhere, it would be more useful both here as well as there. That's what I mean by planetary consciousness.
This classification you made about recent protests being arguments you made between earlier protests a century ago being more political, being more about world forming, and the ones today being more about repairing kind of basic survival like breathing or safety or healthcare. But I have a question with how we reconcile that with also acknowledging the fact that these protests are also increasingly led by women. For instance, what does it mean to classify these protests, which are increasingly female-led, as protests of repair, as projects of repair? And I'm thinking about this in particular in the sense of the fact that stereotypically feminist spheres have been relegated to kind of domestic survival, being smaller, being less political. So in calling these increasingly female-led protests politics of repair and saying that they're less political, how does that play into or not these pre-existing stereotypes?
Thank you. I actually think they're more political, right? Because it's a different definition of politics that I think we need to work with. I think the legacy of radical protests in the 20th century has focused on the seizure of power and the deployment of power, which is like Greek tragedy, right? You know it has hubris, and it is metaphysical. It's about slogans and rhetorics and symbols. It's not actually about realities, which is why the great liberators of the 20th century are also the great dictators of the 20th century. The politics, and I'm keen to emphasize the word politics, as in of the polis, of repair, is more revolutionary because it is less fixated on the fiction of power. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? It is actually more keenly aligned with real-world problems and their real-world solutions that can only move in a planetary direction. There is no way in which a protest about the quality of the air that you breathe in a city like Delhi or Lagos or Mexico City can be about just the seizure of power and a change of regime in Delhi. It has to do with the structural transformation of transport, energy, how we govern cities, what is municipal politics about. And these, if the question of the breathability of air, or the content of food, or the hours of work, or the safety of human beings on the street, or publicness of public transport have to be addressed, they have to take into account large planetary realities in a structural form. This means a huge effort at a much greater intellectual acuity and sharpness, as well as a transformation of the political imaginations of those who are in these protests. It means that the teenagers in Dhaka who are talking about public transport have to think about energy and fuel and electricity and carbon emissions. So it doesn't mean less political work, it actually means more political work. They have time on their side because they are very young. So there's a lot of really fast, hard learning curve activities that actually need to evolve from the politics of the street, so that the fiction of the 20th century's protest movements can be put a little bit to rest. If we look at earlier waves of protest, whether it's the Russian or the French revolutions, they also began with protests about bread, protests about water, protests about who was in prison for how long and how many taxes you had to pay. They were not the earliest protests that provoked the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, or 1789 in France, or 1917 in Russia and in Germany, were actually, in a sense, the kind of protest that we see right now in all over the world. They became something else very quickly. The task before our generation is to make sure that they stay worldly in that sense.
We can take one more question. Natasha, please.
It's just a short question. I was
this production of vocabulary, right? You talked about hysterectomy. How this production actually impacts your artistic practice as a collective? If you could give maybe a concrete example of how.
Yeah. Every concept produces desires. And I think that the most fundamental political task for people in art is the production of new desires and the magnification of existing desires. I'll give you a simple example. That's Buckminster Fuller. And I began with this planetary Grohojagotic sign, which came from a lecture that he gave in New Delhi in 1969. It's a crazy lecture because it starts with, carbon atoms and what to do with the, dodecahedrons and how do you understand elementary forms. And then he makes this remarkable proposal. He says, well, what is India? India is the residue of all the acts of sovereignty by the great powers. India is the last territory which did not yet become a nation state. So he proposes, why don't you in India offer citizenship to the entire world? Now, it's a crazy idea, but it produces an incredible sense of power to what it means to be located in place, in space, and related to the world. Right now in India, as you know, and maybe all of you don't know, there is a huge exercise underway called the National Register of Citizens, which has produced a provisional list that can potentially disenfranchise 4 million human beings in the northeastern province of Assam on the grounds that they may be Bangladeshi. Nobody knows this for sure, but they may be Bangladeshi. So it's the reverse of Buckminster Fuller's proposal. Instead of saying India is a space in which anyone can become a world citizen just by setting foot there, and India then offers the citizenship to the world, we have a regime that is determined to perhaps eventually deport or place 4 million human beings in conditions of some kind of detention. I do not think that an exercise of that nature in numbers has been undertaken in so short a time after the 1930s. Everybody says there's not going to be any violence. But, violence doesn't wait for people's intentions. So here I am reading Buckminster Fuller's crazy proposal, make India the host for everybody in the world. He says they don't even have to come to India. Mohammad Salemi, sitting in Berlin, can say that he's an Indian citizen, just because he wants to. And that's India's gift to the world, because it is not sovereign in the way that other histories have concretized sovereignty. It's too late now for Buckminster Fuller's proposal. But I try and imagine what the atmosphere in the room must have been on that night in December 1969 when he gave this lecture. I think people must have been, I think they really must have regretted calling him. And which is a reason why you can't find this lecture. It's very hard to find. Nobody has ever really published it. The only people who ever published it, not even the estate of Buckminster Fuller published it. The Phi Beta Kappa Society of America produces an obscure journal called the American Scholar. That published it, right? So it doesn't show up in his catalog of works. It doesn't show up anywhere. And he said this thing in Delhi, make India world citizens, right? I think that's the power of concepts. Now the thing is, he may have said it, forgotten about it, got disillusioned, Indians are idiots, gone home. But I went to Dhaka, saw Devika's exhibition, looked at the junction of the word planetary and Grohojagotic, and something started working in my head. And I found the text. And that made me think of the necessity of new concepts as animating particles. That's the work of art. The things that we do, that any of you do as curators or artists, may not have immediate purchase, but who cares? We're still looking at cave paintings that are 125,000 years old, right? That's the need for new vocabularies.
So thank you very much, Shuddhabrata Sengupta, and also you for the questions. I think it's time for lunch now. There is something outside, and we are going to meet at 2 punctual. Can I say this? Yeah, on time. Here again, please. Thank you.